Hello everyone and welcome. Today I'm outdoors. I'm outside a cafe where we're having a lunch, a memorial for the late David Ritchie. There's a number of people there and I've snuck out to do this Facebook Live. So my apologies today, the sound is a bit less than perfect. The vision is also a bit less than perfect. But hopefully this may still be of use to some people who are on here. So today what am I going to talk about? Today I'm talking about transitioning from the public service to startup or business and how to go about that. Some of these tips may also be suitable for those of you who are thinking about transitioning from corporate life, and some of them will be specific to the public service. If you have any comments or anything else on this, let me know. Now first I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experience. So I was in the Commonwealth Public Service for nearly 20 years. When I first started in the Commonwealth Public Service, I never expected to stay. I thought I'd move to Canberra for 6 to 12 months and then I'd go off to Hong Kong and maybe be a lawyer. But that didn't happen that way. It ended up that I ended up staying for nearly 20 years in that role. And there were a number of reasons for staying. You know, it's actually quite a good income. I'd moved to Canberra, it's quite a good lifestyle. And, you know, there's a lot of opportunities to do some exciting and interesting work. And then 18 months ago, I felt the calling that I really wanted to lean into my passions and do that full time. Also, the area that I was working in had become toxic, which was a further sign, I think, that I needed to listen to my intuition and go. And I did that, and I resigned and started 3 businesses: the Joyful Frugalista, the Joyful Business Club, this one, and also the Joyful Fashionista, which is, you know, probably a bit of overkill, but that's just what happened. And then a couple of months ago, unexpectedly out of the blue, I was approached by a former colleague and asked to go back. So I'm currently working in my former job full time for a short period of time. But having that sort of experience of being out, in the public service, then out and then back, it's given me a bit of pause to reflect on some of the things. So I'm going to talk firstly about 5 things to consider as you're preparing to leave, because usually it's not a snap decision. It's not an easy decision to leave what they call in Chinese the iron rice bowl. Like, it's quite a hard process to get into the public service. There's the interview process. There's also the security background checking. There's a lot of things that happen. It can often take 12 to 18 months to get in. So when you decide to leave, you don't do that easily or readily. So it's often, you know, quite a lot of things to think about. And then I want to talk about some of the challenges or issues I faced in terms of transitioning that may also be useful to you. So the first one is the side hustle. So usually people will tell you, okay, you want to leave at some point before you go out full time and do your business, you know, do it as a side hustle first, build up clients, start making your product from a garage, start doing things on the side, and build up your business that way. So you're not just kind of like stopping suddenly and then going to something. And because that's kind of risky. It's like jumping out of an airplane without a parachute, right? And so that's, you know, certainly that was my experience. I did build up a side hustle. But when you are a public servant, you have to abide by the Australian Public Service Code of Conduct, and also internal departmental and other guidance on what you can do out of hours. Basically, when you're a Commonwealth official, you have certain obligations that are above and beyond what you'd have in most people's corporate sector. And usually that prevents anyone doing any outside forms of employment without permission. And it can also curtail or limit the activities that you have on social and other media. Now, that's doesn't necessarily mean you can't work outside of work, but it's just really important to understand what your department's guidelines are. It's really important to act in integrity with that and consistent with that. Don't just say, well, you know, Serena did it. She started writing while she was still, you know, employed, and it was all fine. It was fine, but that said, I had a lot of approvals in place that I had sought before I did that. I sought approval from my branch head. It had been reported to security. I was very aware with what my department's code of conduct and other ethics were before I did that. Now, that's especially important if you are thinking also about doing some work that is a bit similar to what you're doing. There may be times when it is not appropriate for you to just test that market before you leave. And in fact, there might even be issues of conflict of interest after you leave. So it's really important that you understand what these guidelines are and act appropriately. Because, of course, the last thing you want to do is to get fired or reprimanded for doing the wrong thing as you're planning to leave. The second is to think about what training you could do in your current role that's going to prepare you for the next stage of life. Now, I wish I had done this more. I had it as a strategic objective for about 2 years before I left, and yet I got so busy at work I didn't do that. Now, when I say training, what I mean is things that are valid training opportunities in your work that will help you with the job you are doing in your work, but will also help you in your future work. So one of the real benefits, particularly of the Australian Public Service, and we often don't think of that when we're in it, is that they have really generous training opportunities. Usually they'll have domestic training courses, and sometimes you may be eligible for external training courses as well. So, for instance, if you're planning to go out and do things on social media, consider getting social media training, or training in writing, or training in project management, or training in leadership, training in communication generally. These skills will help you do better in your public service job or your corporate job, and they'll also really help you when you leave. It'll help you to develop new insights. And in fact, a lot of the things that I'm doing, particularly in the women's empowerment space, was largely inspired by a course I did in women's leadership several years ago. So about 4 years ago now, I think, I did a course called Great Leaders Are Made with Avril Henry, who is a real expert in women's leadership and empowerment. Now, I did that course. It was funded by my current and my former employer, who are both the same, with a view to enhancing women in leadership in the organisation. And I certainly used a lot of those skills in the workplace, but it also inspired me to think more deeply about women's empowerment, particularly economic empowerment in general, and to make that a focus of what I've done post-work. 3 is to, while you're still employed, find jobs or roles that are going to expand your skills to what you want to be doing next. Now, the disclaimer here is, be mindful of conflict of interest with this as well. Don't set yourself up to be stealing the same clients and doing the same things where there might be a conflict of interest. But just think broadly about where you want to be in your next phase of your life, and gravitate to roles that are going to do that. For instance, if you want to do training, say you want to do leadership training when you leave, maybe a first step is to saying, well, look, I might train on IT systems, or I might train on, be a trainer in internal processes, and get relevant training certification and do that job. Now, it mightn't be the sort of training you plan to do in your business, but you are still learning a lot about training, about how to prepare training materials, how to deliver and structure and deliver a course, how to receive feedback, how to engage. So think about where you want to be, and it's okay in a workplace, because you don't have to say to people, look, I'm going to leave in 2 years. They don't need to know that. But often a willingness to take on different tasks might be really useful. You might say, well, I'll take responsibility for Facebook, or I'll take responsibility for a LinkedIn page. Put your hand up for those additional responsibilities that also are in line with your ultimate purpose and where you want to be. So that's number 3. The fourth one is actually about preparing your money too. So thinking about saving money up so you've got an emergency fund, and also, thinking about how you can utilise things like superannuation and salary sacrifice to your benefit. Now, superannuation is amazing, but it really is of benefit when you are in a stable job, particularly in a stable employment of over $85,000 or more a year, where you have those options to make additional salary sacrifice contributions into super. And some Commonwealth public servants and state public servants as well have additional super funds that are very good and have additional benefits in them. So it's really important to understand that and how it works, because it is a huge asset, and to utilise it to its maximum before you leave. Because once you leave and you're on your own, it can take quite a while sometimes to build up a money stream. I mean, some people can do it straight away, but don't put the pressure on yourself expecting there's something wrong with you if you don't, because things can be hard, especially as we saw last year and this year in COVID years. Things may not happen the way you expected it to, and you might have to pivot quite quickly. So make sure both that you are looking after your long-term financial future by building up your super, taking advantage of any things like salary sacrifice deductions to do things like, buying a good computer you might need for work now, or a car you might need for work now, and also saving up emergency funds so that you have some money to tide you over as you're building up your business. The fifth tip, as you're preparing to leave too, is to maintain good contacts. So often in a professional job, you are meeting with people, you're liaising with people, you are building up a stable of relationships and networks. And you might not even be aware that you are doing that. It's just part of your job. But every time you do something, you pick up the phone, you send an email, you attend a meeting, people are seeing you, you're projecting your brand, and you are making an impression on people, good or bad or otherwise, hopefully very good, whether you like it or not. Now, noting what I said earlier about conflict of interest, it's certainly not appropriate to remove data from a government or even a corporate database, to remove that details and to take them with you. That is not your property. It's not appropriate, nor in many cases is it appropriate for you to suddenly have commercial relationships with some people you might have had sensitive dealings with and inside knowledge about what they're doing, and you would need to be really carefully aware of what your department's guidelines are in that case. But that said, in a generic sense, it's important that you maintain those relationships. Now, a good way to do that is, for instance, just to have a good LinkedIn account and to have good networks and contacts with people on LinkedIn. For instance, in my last job, I was put my hand up for helping to organise a planning day, and I took responsibility for inviting a lot of really amazing speakers. Now, as I was doing that, I was doing a lot of research on their LinkedIn accounts, mainly to work out how to contact them. I thought, why not? I'm just going to connect with these people. I mean, it's valid, I'm speaking to them, they know who I am. And so that was a way that I could kind of grow my own contact list without doing anything that was inappropriate in a workplace. It wasn't a private or confidential list. And it made it easier for me too to contact them and to invite them to functions as well. So just think in terms of your interactions, your valid interactions in your workplace and your function, how you can grow your LinkedIn list too. And I would also say too that it's important in terms of keeping relationships with your department or your business too, both where you work and other areas. Make sure you leave on good terms, as you never know when you might need those contacts to give you a referee. You might never know what they might be saying about you when you're not there as well. And in my case, you might want to go back to work there. And it really helps when you've got great reputation and when people do a bit of digging, they can see that you left on good terms and with integrity, because you never know when you might need to go back, either full-time or otherwise. So now I just wanted to move to some of the challenges or the issues that I faced when transitioning out of the public service and into my own business, and things I sort of knew but I sort of wish I would have thought of a bit earlier. And one is to realise how much that those generic skills that I had developed, particularly good communication skills and good judgment skills, how well they stood me in stead. So there's a tendency to think that when you're doing a specific job, say a specific department, in the public service, that those skills are not transferable, that, it's somehow you're not in the real world and that those skills aren't useful. Nothing could be further from the truth. Usually you're hired for these roles because you have great background and you have great communication skills, and those communication skills are amazing. And I'm realising more and more how marketable those skill sets are. And it's not just the ability to write a good brief, it's the whole package of being able to communicate with diverse range of stakeholders and build relationships. And this is something you might think is obvious, but not everyone can do it. And those skill sets will transfer really well to the private sector and doing your own business, because you will be really familiar with how to network and how to build up contacts, and also to how to communicate about what you are doing. The second thing that I came across was sales. Now, I always thought I would be ace at sales, but in reality, for the last 20 years, I haven't been in a sales role in the public service. And, arguably, I haven't really done a lot of sales. And so sales can be a difficult thing. It for some people. It involves a lot of self-confidence, particularly putting yourself out there, and involves also getting over rejection and learning not to take those setbacks too personally. Now, when you're working in a public service job, it is a little bit different. You're not exposed to having to make those hard sales in the same way, especially in most departments. You are very good at meeting deadlines and, managing different things, but not necessarily selling things. I mean, some departments are, particularly where there's, KPIs that have to be reached, but not everyone. And I actually found this quite difficult. I found myself saying I'm not good at sales and all this kind of negative stuff, and I realised it's just a skill set that I really hadn't learnt. And I knew I did need to take on a lot of that. So in the lead up to me leaving, I took on things like selling entertainment books, memberships to support a work charity, and I took on a few other things. But it's worth thinking about, within your community, what kind of sales roles could you take on, whether it's helping out at a school fete, pitching sponsorship relationships for those sorts of things, helping a friend sell at a market on the weekend, but just thinking about how you develop those sales skills, because usually that's something that you won't be able to get training for while you're in the workplace, because it's probably not related to the skill set you need. Third is the just do it. Now, we've all seen the Nike ad. We all know what it's like. But when you're in a public service environment, those who've been there will know that it often takes a lot longer for things to establish. Like, for instance, I have with several businesses just, registered a URL and set up a Facebook account like within minutes, because I felt called to do that. Now, in a public service environment, you can't just do that. So usually it's a very long consultative process. For instance, you have to put in place plans, you have to get them signed off, you have to talk to lots of people. Anytime you do any kind of major decision, it's a major consultative process. Now, that's useful because stakeholder building is very important. But what I found was that I was sometimes almost waiting with good ideas, like waiting for validation for others rather than just going and doing it myself. And that was quite a mind shift for me. Like, yeah, actually, I am a sole trader. I don't have to wait for anyone to tell me this is a good idea. I don't have to wait for a committee to decide on it. I can just do it. And that was liberating and scary at the same time. So just be aware that if you are transitioning from somewhere where there has been a highly consultative groupthink type culture to being on your own, it is actually quite scary when it's like, yeah, I can just try things. So that is number 3. The fourth is all about risk and appetite for risk. Now, I was working in a department which was consistently scored quite low in terms of various APS surveys that talked about risk appetite, and had been criticised by some think tanks for having a low risk appetite. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't take risks at all. In some ways, they did some amazing things. They also had a specific innovation agenda for a number of years that they really focused on. So there was a conscious effort to improve that. But it is different. Risk in a public sector context is very different to risk in an individual context. And having been back now and, been working on some risk mitigation strategies for a particular project, I've really been thinking about it. And, the general public holds government to a much higher accountability than it does to individuals. There's a lot more pressure to get things right, and there's a lot more tendency to blame when things go wrong. So accordingly, the risk appetite in a public context, even when dealing with things such as COVID, is quite different to you individually. So once again, it's a bit like the groupthink issue I mentioned before. This appetite for risk is something that's a bit scary. Like, people who've been entrepreneurs through a young age are really used to just trying things and see if they work. People who've been in the public service who are thinking of doing something new, it can be quite scary. And even though I myself am probably one of those ones who just jumps in and then thinks later, find myself grappling with that a little bit. But it's essential for startups to have that mantra of imperfect action. You mightn't be able to get away with saying that in the public service. I think I've tried that a few times, saying imperfect action, and people literally nearly flip out. So I've learned now in a public service environment to talk about risk mitigation strategies rather than imperfect action, because people will just flip out. But in a startup world, it's all about imperfect action and daring to have the courage to do something, because the first steps are usually not perfect. It certainly wasn't with the Joyful Business Club. It certainly isn't with this Facebook Live today with all the background music, but you've just got to do that. The next thing is this whole concept of building a personal brand versus being a team player. Now, it's a bit similar to what I've said with these other points, but most of my public service career has been about working in a team, and team members don't usually like it when one person stands out and they're the star. Whenever there's a project, if there's any positive feedback, it's the team at large that gets that. And there's so many layers that are in that. In any work, there are so many different stakeholders, both within your department, with other departments, with other areas. It's very rarely that things are an individual thing. Like I was seconded to a task force for 6 months in another department. I wrote a piece of work. I think it was rewritten by about, a dozen people. So by the time it was kind of finally finished, it wasn't my document, it was a collective voice. But when you're in your own business, you are the star, you are the founder, you are the CEO or whatever you call yourself, and it's all you pretty much. It's all on your terms. So a lot of it is about personal brand development. And it can be quite difficult for people who are used to being a bit humble in the workplace, because that is the collective culture, to suddenly be putting themselves out there as a brand. It just feels a bit odd and it feels a bit weird. So I guess there's some of my thoughts, and I've just had another final one which I will add, which is, I guess I struggled for a while, and I still do sometimes, with setting the routine when you're working from home. Like I thought I would be super organised and up at the crack of dawn, out, running miles and miles and miles, back home, super productive, in bed at an early hour and up again the next day. In reality, I do get up quite early usually. I'm not naturally a morning person, but I do get up early to go to networking and other events. But I find it really hard to develop a structured routine. And that's because it's really up to me to choose what work I choose to do, or even not every day. It's a bit like people who've worked on a PhD, or people who are, if you remember writing that assignment for uni or for school. It's really easy to leave it all to the last minute, because it's really hard to get over that motivational leap. Now, I think I'm a fairly motivated person, but there are some mornings where I really struggle to get it together and get focused. Yet when I'm in the workplace, as I am back now, it's easy, because I've got a boss telling me what to do. These are the priorities. And we'll say, which is the priority? And we'll agree, and I will just do that. Whereas at home, it's like, oh, is this more of a priority? Well, maybe that's just a stupid idea anyway. I don't know. Is this a priority? So it's actually harder, I think, to get in that groove. It's starting to happen, and there's ways you can kind of improve on that, such as by going to co-working spaces. I have a co-working space at the Canberra Innovation Network, for instance, and it really helps being around other people and mimicking that kind of work life. There's ways you can have online co-working sessions with other people where you're just on Zoom, but you agree that you're just going to work for a period of time. And there's ways that you can just, plan, like get up of a morning and write down what your list is that can do that. But certainly it's a very different mindset to going into an office every day, working for someone else. It's more the mindset challenge which helps with structuring your day. So thank you very much for listening. There are some of my thoughts about some of the things to consider when migrating from one to the other, and some of the challenges or issues I've faced and how I have dealt with it. If this resonates with you, please leave a comment below, and I would love to hear about your experiences. Thank you.